Out of the Silent Planet by C.S. Lewis. Read for you today by Hugh Carr. 11. Ever since he awoke on the spaceship, Ransom had been thinking about the amazing adventure of going to another planet, and about his chances of returning from it. What he had not thought about was being on it. It was with a kind of stupefaction each morning that he found himself neither arriving in nor escaping from, but simply living on Malacandra. Waking, sleeping, eating, swimming, and even, as the days passed, talking. The wonder of it smote him most strongly when he found himself, about 3 weeks after his arrival, actually going for a walk. A few weeks later, he had his favourite walks and his favourite foods. He was beginning to develop habits. He knew a male from a female cross at sight, and even individual differences were becoming plain. Hyoe, who had first found him, miles away to the north, was a very different person from the grey-muzzled, venerable hnakra, who was daily teaching him the language. And the young of the species were different again. They were delightful. You could forget all about the rationality of Horose in dealing with them. Too young to trouble him with the baffling enigma of reason in an inhuman form, they solaced his loneliness, as if he had been allowed to bring a few dogs with him from Earth. The cubs, on their part, felt the liveliest interest in the hairless goblin which had appeared among them. With them, and therefore indirectly with their dams, he was a brilliant success. He was beginning to develop habits. He knew a male from a female cross at sight, and even individual differences were becoming plain. Hyoe, who had first found him, miles away to the north, was a very different person from the grey-muzzled, venerable hnakra, who was daily teaching him the language. And the young of the species were different again. They were delightful. You could forget all about the rationality of Horose in dealing with them. Too young to trouble him with the baffling enigma of reason in an inhuman form, they solaced his loneliness, as if he had been allowed to bring a few dogs with him from Earth. The cubs, on their part, felt the liveliest interest in the hairless goblin which had appeared among them. With them, and therefore indirectly with their dams, he was a brilliant success. Of the community in general, his earlier impressions were all gradually being corrected. His first diagnosis of their culture was what he called Old Stone Age. The few cutting instruments they possessed were made of stone. They seemed to have no pottery, but a few clumsy vessels used for boiling, and boiling was the only cookery they attempted. Their common drinking vessel, dish and ladle all in one, was the oyster-like shell in which he had first tasted Ross hospitality. The fish which it contained was their only animal food. Vegetable fare they had in great plenty and variety, some of it delicious. Even the pinkish-white weed which covered the whole handramit was edible at a pinch, so that if he had starved before Hyoe found him, he would have starved amid abundance. No Ross, however, ate the weed, honodraskrud, for choice, though it might be used faute de mieux on a journey. Their dwellings were beehive-shaped huts of stiff leaf, and the villages, there were several in the neighbourhood, were always built beside rivers for warmth and well upstream towards the walls of the handramit, where the water was hottest. They slept on the ground. They seemed to have no arts except a kind of poetry and music which was practised almost every evening by a team or troop of 4 Hrosse. One recited half-chanting at great length, while the other 3, sometimes singing and sometimes antiphonally, interrupted him from time to time with song. Ransom could not find out whether these interruptions were simply lyrical interludes or dramatic dialogue arising from the leader's narrative. He could make nothing of the music. The voices were not disagreeable, and the scale seemed adapted to human ears, but the time pattern was meaningless to his sense of rhythm. The occupations of the tribe or family were at first mysterious. People were always disappearing for a few days and reappearing again. There was a little fishing and much journeying in boats, of which he never discovered the object. Then one day he saw a kind of caravan of Hrossa setting out by land, each with a load of vegetable food on its head. Apparently there was some kind of trade in Malacandra. He discovered their agriculture in the first week. About a mile down the Handramit, one came to broad lands free of forest and clothed for many miles together in low, pulpy vegetation in which yellow, orange, and blue predominated. Later on, there were lettuce-like plants about the height of a terrestrial birch tree. Where one of these overhung the warmth of water, you could step into one of the lower leaves and lie deliciously as in a gentle moving, fragrant hammock. Elsewhere, it was not warm enough to sit still for long out of doors. The general temperature of the Handramit was that of a fine winter's morning on earth. These food-producing areas were worked communally by surrounding villages, and division of labour had been carried to a higher point than he expected. Cutting, drying, storing, transport, and something like manuring were all carried on, and he suspected that some at least of the water channels were artificial. But the real revolution in his understanding of the Hrossa began when he learned enough of their language to attempt some satisfaction of their curiosity about himself. In answer to their questions, he began by saying that he had come out of the sky. hnakra immediately asked from which earth or planet Handra. Ransom, who had deliberately given a childish version of the truth in order to adapt it to the supposed ignorance of his audience, was a little annoyed to find hnakra painfully explaining to him that he could not live in the sky because there was no air in it. He might have come through the sky, but he must have come from a Handra. He was quite unable to point out Earth to them in the night sky. They seemed surprised at his inability, and repeatedly pointed out to him a bright planet low on the western horizon, a little south of where the sun had gone down. He was surprised that they selected a planet instead of a mere star and stuck to their choice. Could it be possible that they understood astronomy? Unfortunately, he still knew too little of the language to explore their knowledge. He turned the conversation by asking them the name of the bright southern planet, and was told that it was Malacandra, the silent world or planet. "Why do you call it Thulk?" he asked. "Why silent?" No one knew.
"The Soroni know,"
said Hnakra.
"That is the sort of thing they know."
Then he was asked how he had come, and made a very poor attempt at describing the spaceship. But again,
"The Soroni would know."
Had he come alone? No, he had come with 2 others of his kind. Bad men, or bent men was the nearest Hrossian equivalent, who tried to kill him, but he had run away from them. The Hrossa found this very difficult, but all agreed that he ought to go to Oyasa. Oyasa would protect him. Ransom asked who Oyasa was. Slowly, and with many misunderstandings, he hammered out the information that Oyasa, 1, lived in Meldalorn, 2, knew everything and ruled everyone, 3, had always been there, and 4, was not a Hross nor one of the Sereni. Then Ransom, following his own idea, asked if Oyasa had made the world. The Hrossa almost barked in the fervour of their denial. Did the people of Thalcandra not know that Maladil the Young had made and still ruled the world? Even a child knew that. Where did Maladil live? Ransom asked.
With the Old One.
And who was the Old One? Ransom did not understand the answer. He tried again. Where was the Old One?
He is not that sort, said Hrondra, that he has to live anywhere.
And proceeded to a good deal which Ransom did not follow. But he followed enough to feel once more a certain irritation. Ever since he had discovered the rationality of the Hrossa, he had been haunted by a conscientious scruple as to whether it might not be his duty to undertake their religious instruction. Now, as a result of his tentative efforts, he found himself being treated as if he were the savage, and being given a first sketch of civilized religion, a sort of Hrossian equivalent of the shorter catechism. It became plain that Maladil was a spirit without body, parts, or passions.
He is not a Hnau,
said the Hrossa. What is now? Asked Ransom.
You are Hnau. I am Hnau. The Sereni are Hnau. The Pfiffitrigi are Hnau.
Pfiffitrigi? Said Ransom.
More than 10 days' journey to the west,
said Hnonra.
The Hrandra sinks down, not into the Handramit, but into a broad place, an open place, spreading every way. 5 days' journey from the north to the south of it, 10 days' journey from the east to the west. The forests are of other colors than of here. They are blue and green. It is very deep there. It goes to the roots of the world. The best things that can be dug out of the earth are there. The Pfiffitrigi live there. They delight in digging. What they dig they soften with fire and make things of it. They are a little people, smaller than you, long in the snout, pale, busy. They have long limbs in front. No Hnau can match them in making and shaping things, as none can match us in singing. But let Hman see.
He turned and spoke to one of the younger Hrossa, and presently passed from hand to hand there came to him a little bowl. He held it close to the firelight and examined it. It was certainly of gold, and Ransom realized the meaning of Divine's interest in Malacandra. "Is there much of this thing?" he asked. Yes, he was told. It was washed down in most of the rivers, but the best and most of it among them, the Pfiffitrigi, and it was they who were skilled in making it. Ar-bo-chru, they called it, sun's blood. He looked at the bowl again. It was covered with fine etching. He saw pictures of Hrossa and of a smaller, almost frog-like animals, and then of Sorns. He pointed to the latter inquiringly.
Soroni,
said the Hrossa, confirming his suspicions.
They live up almost on the Hrandra, in the big caves.
The frog-like animals, or tapir-headed frog-bodied animals, were Pfiffitrigi. Ransom turned it over in his mind. On Malacandra, apparently, 3 distinct species had reached rationality, and none of them had yet exterminated the other 2. It concerned him intensely to find out who was the real master. "Which of the Hnau rule?" he asked.
Oyasa rules,
was the reply. "Is he Hnau?" This puzzled them a little. The Seroni, they thought, would be better at that kind of question. Perhaps Oyasa was now, but a very different now. He had no death and no young. These Saroni, they know more than the Harossa? Asked Ransom. Now, this produced more of a debate than an answer. What emerged finally was that the Saroni or Sorns were perfectly helpless in a boat, and could not fish to save their lives. They could hardly swim, and could make no poetry. And even when Harossa made it for them, they could only understand the most inferior sorts. But they were admittedly good at finding out things about the stars, and understanding the darker utterances of Oyasa, and telling what happened in Malacandra longer ago than anyone could remember. Ah, the intelligentsia, thought Ransom. They must be the real rulers, however it is disguised. He tried to ask what would happen if the Sorns used their wisdom to make the Harossa do things. This was as far as he could get in his halting Malacandrian. The question did not sound nearly so urgent in this form as it would have done if he had been able to say, used their scientific resources for the exploitation of their uncivilized neighbors. But he might have spared his pains. The mention of the Sorns' inadequate appreciation of poetry had diverted the whole conversation into literary channels. Of the heated and apparently technical discussion which followed, he understood not a syllable. Naturally, his conversations with the Harossa did not all turn on Malacandra. He had to repay them with some information about the earth. He was hampered in this both by the humiliating discoveries which he was constantly making of his own ignorance about his native planet, and partly by his determination to conceal some of the truth. He did not want to tell them too much of our human wars and industrialisms. He remembered how H.G. Wells's Cavor had met his end on the moon. Also, he felt shy. A sensation akin to that of physical nakedness came over him whenever they questioned him too closely about men, the hnakra, as they called them. Moreover, he was determined not to let them know that he had been brought here to be given to the Sorns, for he was becoming daily more certain that these were the dominant species. What he did tell them fired the imagination of the Harossa. They all began making poems about the strange hnakra, where the plants were hard like stone, and the earthweed green like rock, and the waters cold and salt, and Hnakra lived out on top of the hnakra. They were even more interested in what he had to tell them of the aquatic animal with snapping jaws, which he had fled from in their own world, and even in their own hnakramit. It was a hnakra, they all agreed. They were intensely excited. There had not been a hnakra in the valley for many years. The youth of the Harossa got out their weapons, primitive harpoons with points of bone, and the very cubs began playing at hnakra hunting in the shallows. Some of the mothers showed signs of anxiety and wanted the cubs to be kept out of the water, but in general the news of the hnakra seemed to be immensely popular. Huey set off at once to do something to his boat, and Ransom accompanied him. He wished to make himself useful, and was already beginning to have some vague capacity with the primitive Harossian tools. They walked together to Huey's Creek, a stone's throw through the forest. On the way there, where the path was single and Ransom was following Huey, they passed a little she-Haross, not more than a cub. She spoke as they passed, but not to them. Her eyes were on a spot about 5 yards away. "Who do you speak to, Ricky?" said Ransom.
"To the elder."
Where?"
"Did you not see him?"
I saw nothing."
There!"
she cried suddenly.
"Ah, he is gone. Did you not see him?"
"I saw no one."
"Huey!
said the cub.
The Hman cannot see the Eldil.
But Hyoy, continuing steadily on his way, was already out of earshot, and apparently noticed nothing. Ransom concluded that Hriki was pretending, like the young of his own species. In a few moments he rejoined his companion. They worked hard at Hyoy's boat till noon, and then spread themselves on the weed close to the warmth of the creek, and began their midday meal. The warlike nature of their preparations suggested many questions to Ransom. He knew no word for war, but he managed to make Hyoy understand what he wanted to know. Did Saroni and Harossa and Pefefiltrigi ever go out like this, with weapons, against each other?
What for?
Asked Hyoy. It was difficult to explain. If both wanted one thing and neither would give it, said Ransom, would the other one come at last with force, and would they say, give it, or we kill you?
What sort of thing?
Well, food perhaps.
If the other now wanted food, why should we not give it to them? We often do.
But how if we have not enough for ourselves?
But Meledil will not stop the plants growing.
Hyoy, if you had more and more young, would Meledil broaden the Handramit and make enough plants for you all?
The Saroni would know that sort of thing. But why should we have more young?
Ransom found this difficult. At last he said, Is the begetting of young not a pleasure among the Harossa?
A very great one, man. This is what we call love.
If a thing is a pleasure, Ahman wants it again. He might want the pleasure more often than the number of young he could feed. It took Hyoy a long time to get the point.
You mean, he said slowly, that he might do it not only in 1 or 2 years of his life, but again?
Yes.
But why? Why would he want his dinner all day, or want to sleep after he had slept? I do not understand.
But a dinner comes every day. This love, you say, comes only once while the Ross lives?
But it takes his whole life. When he is young, he has to look for his mate. And then he has to court her. Then he begets young. Then he rears them. Then he remembers all this and boils it inside him and makes it into poems and wisdom.
But the pleasure, he must be content only to remember?
That is like saying, my food I must be content only to eat.
I do not understand.
A pleasure is full-grown only when it is remembered. You are speaking, Hman. If the pleasure were one thing and the memory another, it is all the one thing. The Saroni would say it better than I would not now. Not better than I would say it in a poem. What you call remembering is the last part of the pleasure. It is the kra, the last line of the poem. When you and I met, the meeting was over very shortly. It was nothing. Now it is growing something as we remember it. But still, we know very little about it. What it will be when I remember it as I lay down to die. What it makes in me all the days till then. That is the real meeting. The other is only the beginning of it. You say you have poets in your world. Do they not teach you this?
Perhaps some of they do, said Ransom. But even in the poem does not a Ross never long to hear one splendid line over again? Huey's reply unfortunately turned to one of those points in their language which Ransom had not mastered. There were two verbs which, both as far as he could see, meant to long or to yearn, but the Xhosa drew a sharp distinction, even an opposition between them. Huey seemed to merely be saying that every one would long for it, one londele, but no one in his senses could long for it, cholulinthe.
And indeed, he continued, the poem is a good example, for the most splendid line becomes fully splendid only by means of all the lines after it. If you went back to it, you would find it less splendid than you thought. You would kill it. I mean, in a good poem.
But in a bent poem, Huey?
A bent poem is not listened to, Chman.
And how of love in a bent life?
How could life of Chnau be bent?
Do you say, Huey, that there are no bent Xhosa? Huey reflected.
I have heard, he said at last, of something like what you mean. It is said that sometimes, here and there, a cub at a certain age gets strange twists in him. I have heard of one who wanted to eat earth. There might perhaps be somewhere a Xhos likewise that wanted to have the years of love prolonged. I have not heard of it, but it might be. I have heard of something stranger. There is a poem about a Xhos who lived long ago in another Andromeda, who saw all things made two suns in the sky, two heads on the neck, and last of all they say that he fell into such a frenzy that he desired two mates. I do not ask you to believe it, but that is the story, that he loved two Chresni.
Ransom pondered this. Here, unless Huey was deceiving him, was a species naturally content, naturally monogamous. And yet was it so strange? Some animals, he knew, had regular breeding seasons, and if nature could perform the miracle of turning the sexual impulse outward at all, why could it not go further and fix it, not morally, but instinctively, to a single object? He even remembered dimly having heard that some terrestrial animals, some of the lower animals, were naturally monogamous. Among the Xhosa, anyway, it was obvious that unlimited breeding and promiscuity were as rare as the rarest perversions. At last it dawned upon him that it was not they, but his own species, that were the puzzle. That the Xhosa should have such instincts was mildly surprising, but how came it that the instincts of the Xhosa so closely resembled the unattained ideals of that far-divided species, man, whose instincts were so deplorably different? What was the history of man? But Huey was speaking again.
Undoubtedly, he said, Meledil made it so. How could there be enough to eat if everyone had 20 young? And how could we endure to live and let time pass if we were always crying for one day or 1 year to come back? If we did not know that every day is a life, fills the whole life with expectation and a memory that there are that day.
All the same, said Ransom, unconsciously nettled on behalf of his world, Meledil has let in the hnakra.
Oh, that is so different. I long to kill this hnakra, as he also longs to kill me. I hope that my ship will be the first, when my spear, the straight spear, when the black jaws snap. And if he kills me, My people will mourn, and my brothers will desire still more to kill him. But they will not wish that there were no hnakra, nor do I. How can I make you understand when you do not understand the poets? The hnakra is our enemy, but he is also our beloved. We feel in our hearts his joy as he looks down from the mountains of water in the north where he was born. We leap with him when he jumps the falls when the winter comes, and the lake smokes higher than our heads. It is with his eyes that we can see it, and know that his roaming time has come. We hang images of him in our houses, and the sign of all Rosa is the hnakra. In him the spirit of the valley lives, and our young play at being hnakri as soon as they can splash in the shallows.
And then he kills them?
Not often them. The Rosa would be bent Rosa if they did let him get so near. Long before he had come down so far, we would have sought him out. No, man, it is not a few deaths roving the world around him that make a hnau miserable. It is a bent hnau who would blacken the world. And I say also this, I do not think the forest would be so bright, nor the water so warm, nor love so sweet, if there were no danger in the lakes. I will tell you of a day in my life that has shaped me. Such a day as comes only once, like love, or serving Oyasa in Meldelon. When I was young, not much more than a cub, when I went far, far up the Handramit to the land where the stars shine at midday, and even water is cold. A great waterfall I climbed. I stood on the shore of Balki, the pool, which is the place of most awe in all worlds. The walls of it go up for ever and ever, and huge and holy images are cut in them, the works of old times. There is a fall called the Mountain of Water, because I have stood there alone, Meledil and I, and even Oyasa sent me no word. My heart has been higher, my song deeper all my days. But did you think it would have been so, unless I had known that in Balki hnakri dwelled? There I drank life, because death was in the pool. That is the best of drinks save one.
Which one? Asked Ransom.
Death itself, in the day I drink it, and go to Meledil.
Shortly after that they rose and resumed their work. The sun was declining as they came back through the wood. It occurred to Ransom to ask Hyoy a question. Hyoy, he said, it comes into my head that when I first saw you and before you saw me, you were already speaking. This was how I knew that you were now, for otherwise I should have thought you were a beast and run away. Who are you speaking to?
To an Eldil.
What is that? I saw no one.
Are there no Eldila in your world, man? That must be strange.
But what are they?
They come from Oyasa. They are, I suppose, a kind of now.
As we came out today, I passed a child who said she was talking to an Eldil, but I could see nothing.
One can see by looking at your eyes, man, that they are different from ours. But Eldila are hard to see. They are not like us. Light goes through them. You must be looking in the right place at the right time, and that is not likely to come about unless the Eldil wishes to be seen. Sometimes you can mistake them for a sunbeam or even a moving of the leaves. But when you look, you see that it was an Eldil and that it is gone. But whether your eyes can ever see them, I do not know. The Soroni would know that.
13. The whole village was astir next morning before the sunlight, already visible on the Hnakra, had penetrated the forest. By the light of the cooking fires, Ransom saw an incessant activity of Hrossa. The females were pouring out steaming food from clumsy pots. hnakra was directing the transportation of piles of spears to the boats. Hjoi, in the midst of the group of the most experienced hunters, was talking too rapidly and too technically for Ransom to follow. Parties were arriving from neighbouring villages, and the cubs, squealing with excitement, were running hither and thither among their elders. He found that his own share in the hunt had been taken for granted. He was to be in Hjoi's boat, with Hjoi and Hwin. The two Hrossa would take turns to paddle, while Ransom and the disengaged Hross would be in the bows. He understood the Hrossa well enough to know that they were making him the noblest offer in their power, and that Hjoi and Hwin were each tormented by the fear lest he be paddling when the hnakra appeared. A short time ago in England, nothing would have seemed more impossible to Ransom than to expect the post of honour and danger in an attack upon an unknown but clearly deadly aquatic monster. Even more recently, when he had first fled the Sorns, or had been lain pitting himself in the forest by night, he would hardly have seen it in his power to be doing what he was intending to do today. For his intention was clear. Whatever happened, he must show that the human species were also Hnau. He was only too well aware that such resolutions might look very different when the moment came, but he felt an unwanted assurance to somehow or other that he would be able to go through with it. It was necessary, and the necessary was always possible. Perhaps, too, there was something in the air he now breathed, or in the society of the Hrossa, which had begun to work a change in him. The lake was just giving back the first rays of the sun when he found himself kneeling side by side with Hwin, as he had been told to do, in the bows of Hjoi's ship, with a little pile of throwing spears between his knees, and one in his right hand, stiffening his body against the motion as Hjoi paddled them out into their place. At least 100 boats were taking part in the hunt. They were in 3 parties. The central, and far the smallest, was to work its way up the current by which Hjoi and Ransom had descended after their first meeting. Longer ships than he had yet seen, 8-paddled ships, were being used for this. The habit of the hnakra was to float down the current whenever he could. Meeting the ships, he would presumably dart out into the still water to the left or right. Hence the central party slowly beat up the current. The light ships, paddling far faster, would cruise at will up and down either side as to receive the quarry as soon as it broke what might be called his cover. In this game, numbers and intelligence were on the side of the Hrossa. The hnakra had speed on its side, and also invisibility, for he could swim underwater. He was nearly invulnerable, except through his open mouth. If the 2 hunters in the bows of the boat he had made for muffed their shots, this was usually the last of them and of their boat. In the light skirmishing parties, there were 2 things a brave hunter could aim at. He could keep well back and close to the long ships, where the hnakra was most likely to break out, or he could get as far forward as possible in hope of meeting the hnakra going at full speed and yet untroubled by the hunt, and of inducing it by a well-aimed spear to leave the current then and there. One could thus anticipate the beaters and kill the beast, if that was how the matter ended, on one's own. This was the desire of Hoi and Hwin, and almost, so strongly they infected him, of ransom. Hence hardly had the heavy craft of the beaters begun their slow progress up current amid a wall of foam that he found his own ship speeding northward as fast as Hoi could drive her, already passing boat after boat and making for the freest water. The speed was exhilarating. In the cold morning, the warmth of the blue expanse they were clearing was not unpleasant. Behind them arose, re-echoed from the rock pinnacles on either side of the valley, the bell-like, deep-throated, deep-mouthed voices of more than 200 Hrossa, more musical than the cry of hounds, but closely akin to the quality as in purport. Something long sleeping in the blood awoke in Ransom. It did not seem impossible at this moment that even he might be the hnakra slayer, and the fame of hnakra punt might be handed down to the posterity in his world that knew no other man. But he had had such dreams before, and knew how they ended. Imposing humility on the newly risen riot of his feelings, he turned his eyes to the troubled water of the current which they were skirting, without entering, and watching intently. For a long time, nothing happened. He became conscious of the stiffness of his attitude, and deliberately relaxing his muscles. Presently Hwin reluctantly went aft to paddle, and Hoi came forward to take his place. Almost as soon as the change had been effected, Hoi spoke softly to him and said, without taking his eyes off the current,
"There is an Eldil coming to us over the water."
Ransom could see nothing, or nothing that he could distinguish from imagination, and the dance of sunlight on the lake. A moment later, Hoi spoke again, but not to him.
"What is it, Skyborn?"
What happened next was the most uncanny experience Ransom had had yet on Malacandra. He heard the voice. It seemed to come out of the air, about a yard above his head, and it was almost an octave higher than the Hross's, higher even than his own. He realized that a very little difference in his ear would have made the Eldil as inaudible to him as it was invisible.
"It is the man with you, Hoi," said the voice. "He ought not to be there. He ought to be going to Oyasa. Bent Hanau of his own kind from Malacandra are following him. He should go to Oyasa. If they find him anywhere, there will be an evil."
"He hears you, Skyborn,"
said Hoi.
"And have you no message for my wife? You know what she wishes to be told."
"I have a message for Hleri," said the Eldil, "but you will not be able to take it. I go to her myself. All that is well, only let the man go to Oyasa."
There was a moment's silence.
"He is gone,"
said Hwin,
"and we have lost our share in the hunt." "Ah, yes," said Hoi with a sigh. "We must put Haman ashore and teach him the way to Merdalon."
Ransom was not so sure of his courage, but that one part of him felt an instant relief at the idea of any diversion from their present business. But the other part of him urged him to hold on to his newfound manhood, now or never. With the companions or with none, he must leave a deed on his memory instead of one more broken dream. It was in obedience to something like conscience that he exclaimed, "No, no! There is time for that after the hunt.
We must kill the hnakra first."
"Once an Eldil has spoken," began Hyoy.
But suddenly, Hwin gave a great cry, a bark, Ransom would have called it 3 weeks ago, and pointed. There, not a furlong away, was the torpedo-like track of foam, and now, visible through a wall of foam, they caught the metallic glint of the monster's sides. Hwin was paddling furiously. Hyoy threw and missed. As his first spear smote the water, his second was already in the air. This time it must have touched the hnakra. It wheeled right out of the current. Ransom saw a great black pit of its mouth, twice open and twice shut, with its snap of shark-like teeth. He had thrown himself now, hurriedly, excitedly, with unpractised hand. "Back!" shouted Hyoy to Hwin, who was already backing water with every pound of his vast strength. Then all became confused. He heard Hwin shout, "Shaw!" and there came a shock that flung him forward almost into the hnakra's jaws, and he found out at that moment he was up to his waist in water. It was at him the teeth were snapping. Then he flung shaft after shaft into the great cavern of gaping mouth of the brute, and he saw Hyoy perched incredibly on its back, on its nose, bending forward and hurling from there. Almost at once the hross was dislodged and fell with a wide splash nearly 10 yards away, but the hnakra was killed. It was wallowing on its side, bubbling out its black life. The water around him was dark and stank. When he recollected himself, they were all on shore, wet, steaming, trembling with exertion, and embracing one another. It did not now seem strange to him to be clasped to a breast of wet fur. The breath of the Hrossa, which, though sweet, was not human breath, but it did not offend him. He was one with them. The difficulty which they, accustomed to more than one rational species, had perhaps never felt, was now overcome. They were all now. They had stood shoulder to shoulder in the face of an enemy, and the shapes of their heads no longer mattered, and he, even Ransom, had come through it and had not been disgraced. He had grown up. They were on a little promontory free of forest, on which they had run aground in the confusion of the fight. The wreckage of the boat and the corpse of the monster lay confused together in the water beside them. No sound from the rest of the hunting party was audible. They had been almost a mile ahead when they met the hnakra. All three sat down to recover their breath.
"So,"
said Hyoy,
"we are hnakra punti. This is what I have wanted all my life."
At that moment, Ransom was deafened by a loud sound. A perfectly familiar sound, which was the last thing he expected to hear. It was a terrestrial, human, and civilized sound. It was even European. It was the crack of an English rifle, and Hyoy, at his feet, was struggling to rise and gasping. There was blood on the white weed where he struggled. Ransom dropped on his knees beside him. The huge body of the Hross was too heavy for him to turn around. Hwin helped him. "Hyoy, can you hear me?" said Ransom, his face close to the round seal-like head. "Hyoy, it is through me that this has happened. It is the other manna who have hit you, the Bentu that brought me to Malacandra. They can throw death at a distance with the thing they have made. I should have told you. We are all a bent race.
We have come here to bring evil on Malacandra. We are only half, Joy!
His speech died away into the inarticulate. He did not know the words for forgive, or shame, or fault. Hardly the word for sorry. He could only stare into Hyoi's distorted face in speechless guilt. But the Ross seemed to understand. It was trying to say something, and Ransom laid his ear close to the working mouth. Hyoi's dulling eyes were fixed on his own, but the expression of a Ross was not even now perfectly intelligible to him. It muttered, and then at last,
hnakra.
And there came a contortion of the whole body, a gush of blood and saliva from the mouth. His arms gave way in the sudden dead weight of the sagging head, and Hyoi's face became as alien and animal as if it had seemed at their first meeting. The glazed eyes and the slowly stiffening bedraggled fur were like those of any dead beast found in an earthly wood. Ransom resisted an infantile impulse to break out into imprecations on Western Divine. Instead, he raised his eyes to meet those of Hwin, who was crouching, Harossa do not kneel, on the other side of the corpse. "I am in the hands of your people, Hwin," he said. "They must do as they will, but if they are wise, they will kill me, and certainly they will kill those other two."
"One does not kill now," said Hwin. "Only Oyasa does that. But these others, where are they?"
Ransom glanced around. It was an open on the They were in the open on the promontory, but thick wood came down to where it joined the mainland, perhaps 200 yards away. "Somewhere in the wood," he said. "Lie down, Hwin. Here where the ground is lowest. They may throw from their thing again." He had some difficulty in making Hwin do as he suggested. When both were lying in the ground, their feet almost touching the water, the Hross spoke to him.
"Why did they kill him?"
he asked. "They would not know that he was Snow," said Ransom. "I have told you that there is only one kind of Snow in our world. They would think he was a beast. If they thought that, they would kill him for pleasure or in fear or—" He hesitated. "Because they were hungry. But I must tell you the truth, Hwin. They would kill even a hnau, knowing it to be a hnau, if they thought its death would serve them." There was a short silence. "I am wondering," said Ransom, "if they saw me. It is for me that they are looking. Perhaps if I went to them, they would be content and come no farther into your land. But why do they not come out of the wood and see what they have killed?"
"Our people are coming,"
said Hwin, turning his head. Ransom looked back and saw the lake black with boats. The main body of the hunt would soon be with them in a few minutes. "They are afraid of the Harossa," said Ransom. "That is why they do not come out of this wood. I will go to them, Hwin."
"No," said Hwin. "I have been thinking. All this has come from not obeying the Eldil. He said you were to go to Oyasa. You ought to have already been on the road. You must go, now."
"But that will leave the bent money here. They will do more harm."
"They will not set on the Harossa. You have said they are afraid. It is more likely that we will come upon them. Never fear, they will not see us or hear us. We will take them to Oyasa. But you must go now, as the Eldil said."
Your people will think I have run away because I'm afraid to look at their faces after Hyoi's death.
It is not a question of thinking, but of what Eldil says. This is cub's talk. Now, listen, I will teach you the way.
The Hross explained to him that 5 days' journey to the south, the Handramit joined another Handramit, and 3 days up this other Handramit, to the west and the north, was Meldalon and the seat of Oyasa. But there was a shorter way, a mountain road, across the corner of the Harandra between the two canyons, which would bring him down to Meldalon on the second day. He must go into the wood before them, and through it till he came to the mountain wall of the Handramit. Then he must walk south along the route of the mountains till he came to a road cut up between them. Up this he must go, and somewhere beyond the tops of the mountains he would come to the tower of Owlgrey. Owlgrey would help him. He would cut weed for his food before he left the forest and came into the rock country. Hwin realized that Ransom might meet the other two Hamana as soon as he entered the wood.
If they catch you, he said, then it will be as you say. They will come no farther into our land. But it is better to be taken on your way to Oyasa than to stay here. And once you are on your way to him, I do not think he will let the Bent One stop you.
Ransom was by no means convinced that this was the best plan either for himself or for the Hrossa, but the stupor of humiliation in which he had lain ever since Hyoi fell forbade him to criticize. He was now anxious only to do whatever they wanted him to do, to trouble them as little as now as possible, and above all, to get away. It was impossible to find out how Hwin felt, and Ransom sternly repressed an insistent, whining impulse to renewed protestations and regrets, self-accusations that might elicit some word of pardon. Hyoi, in his last breath, had called him hnakra slayer, and that was forgiveness generous enough, and with that he must be content. As soon as he had mastered the details of his route, he bade farewell to Hwin and advanced alone towards the forest. Your friend and mine, Moon's cat, is hidden somewhere in this video. Did you see him? If you didn't, it's okay. Go back to the start and watch the video again, and when you do see him, write the time code in which he appears in the comments field. And if you get it right, you get the chance to have the next video dedicated to you or someone you care about. He is quick and hard to spot, as you will see in the places he hid here, here, and here. Best of luck finding him. And don't forget,